Welcome back. I'm talking to Ian Crane about the process known as fracking, which is the pumping of water and sand and other chemicals at high pressure down into a well in order to fracture the local geology in order to get gas and oil to come back up. Now,
exactly.
Now that's the key phrase that you used there, Ian. You said the purpose is to fracture the geology. Now there seems to be controversy over whether this process can cause earthquakes. Can it cause earthquakes?
Well, let's take a look at what occurred in Blackpool 2 years ago. Cuadrilla drilled and fracked 2 wells, and there were 2 seismic events. Now there are occasional seismic events around the UK, but these were, I mean, they weren't, you know, Fukushima level type events, but nonetheless they were more significant than, you know, the normal earthquakes. So immediately there was the suspicion that they were related to the Cuadrilla drilling and fracking activity, so a halt was called.
And was this activity in the sea? No,
this is on land. This is on the Fylde Peninsula just outside Blackpool, in Lancashire.
So this is after this limitation had been lifted, that they're allowed to...
Well, there was no limitation. This was at the point where these were purely exploratory wells.
Right, I see.
So this was the first time really that this process had been tried on land in the UK.
Okay, but it still hadn't been, you know, it still hadn't said, right, we're going to have widespread use on land. It was just kind of an experiment.
It was an experiment,
right,
yeah.
Okay.
And both of these wells, they resulted in, well, these tremors. Cuadrilla commissioned a report, an investigation into this, and in the report it actually states that the seismic events were most probably related to Cuadrilla's drilling and fracking activity. Now, most probably is corporate speak for, we did it.
Yeah, a bit like the, does smoking cause lung cancer?
So, you know, this was as close to an admission as you were going to get. And by the way, I mean, Cuadrilla have now stated that, you know, before any future drilling and fracking, they will put seismic sensors around the area. So obviously, if they had thought that there was no relationship between the fracking and the seismic events, then they wouldn't be so keen to be putting the seismic sensors around the area. But I mean, there's other information related to this. I mean, in the Netherlands, where they've been fracking, there have been seismic events in the Netherlands that are believed to be related to the fracking operation. In Oklahoma, there's been a number of seismic events, and these are not just related to the fracking, but in Oklahoma they've actually been pumping the produced water. Remember, that's the flush after the frack job. They've been pumping the produced water down into disused reservoirs.
Really?
So this produced water, of course, still contains these toxic chemicals. So even though it's not being pumped down in any great pressure, it's just being dropped into the hole for storage purposes. Nonetheless, it's still finding the path of least resistance, and it's believed that a number of the earthquakes in Oklahoma are related to this produced water being put underground. Now, in the US, the oil and gas industry is protected by the government. And in fact, if viewers Google Halliburton loophole, Halliburton loophole, because this was related to Dick Cheney, of course, who was the former chief executive officer of Halliburton. He was CEO of Halliburton from '95 until he was appointed vice president by George W. Bush. And so in 2005, when he was vice president, he effectively instructed the Senate to exempt the oil and gas industry from the environmental protection legislation, which would require the oil and gas industry to report any contamination of water. So the oil and gas industry does not have to report when it contaminates water.
Okay. Now, I did read that in the US, 45% of domestic gas supply in the US would be lost without fracking. So have they been doing this on land in the US?
Yes, they have.
Extensively?
Well, certainly in the last 20 odd years. I mean, it's built up generally. I mean, initially it was fairly low level production. But if we look at places like Colorado, you know, Colorado is an interesting comparison with England, because Colorado is almost exactly twice the size of England. Yet the population of Colorado is 1/10 that of England.
Okay.
So in other words, the population density of England is 20 times that of Colorado. And much of the gas fracking in Colorado has been in areas of relatively low population density. And the effects from fracking are not necessarily felt instantaneously. I mean, actually, one could argue that we got lucky in Blackpool because the seismic events came about almost immediately.
Raised the alarm, if you like.
Exactly, raised the alarm. Because had there not been any seismic reaction, then I am under no illusion that by now we would probably, I wouldn't necessarily say be in full swing, but certainly the number of areas where we were drilling and starting to frack would have increased.
So if they were to advance this agenda, if you like, and they were to get this implemented in the UK, would they make sort of inner cities limited zones, or is that how it would pan out? Would they only do it in rural areas?
Well, I don't know. They may. I mean, let's look at what's going on in Blackpool. I mean, they're just outside Blackpool.
Right.
Literally about 5 miles outside Blackpool.
And also, have studies been done on what the environmental impact is of fracking, Ian?
Well, the oil industry,
on animals,
of course,
farm animals, or water supply, etc.
Well, the oil industry claims that there's absolutely no relationship between subsequent events, and let's use Colorado as an example, because Colorado, has been subjected to the gas fracking for close on 20 years. And what we have seen and what we see in Colorado is large areas where basically the land has become uninhabitable. Now, obviously, people who live in the Midwest, they're reliant on their water supply from boreholes. And many of those landowners have had their water contaminated. Now, the problem is that for many of them, they didn't realize that the water was contaminated. Or if they thought it was contaminated, they didn't realize the magnitude of the contamination. So people have been not just drinking this water, but washing in the water. And what we know is that this contaminated water, because of the chemicals within the frac fluid, the water contains DNA disruptors. It contains neuroinhibitors, and so consequently it impacts on people over a length of time. And one of the documentaries that I encourage people to watch, and a lot of people have heard of Gasland, which was made by a young filmmaker called Josh Fox, but I think there's a better documentary than Gasland. It's called Split Estate, and Split Estate actually refers to the way in which the surface and the minerals are divided in the US, and this applies, or in some states in the US, and it applies in the UK. Split estate means that you, as the landowner, own the surface and maybe about as much soil as it takes to grow a carrot, but anything below that is owned by the state. I mean, in the UK, gold and silver are owned by the Crown, and hydrocarbons by the state. So whatever it is that you've got under the surface is not yours.
The reason why I know this is because of two historians that I've been following the work of, Wilson and Blackett. They're trying to get an archaeological dig done, and the farmer's bit ends there, and then the state or someone else's bit takes over underneath. Now, you and I both know, Ian, if they want to bring in any kind of legislation which might be unpalatable to the public, what they do is they put out fake, contentious articles in the media. Some refer to it as the Hegelian dialectic, and you were just going to show me an example of that.
Well, I mean, obviously we've had this cold spell, through late March and into early April. And this, of course, has been a massive PR boon to the government and to the oil and gas industry. And this is from Saturday, March 23rd, and this is the headline. Can we see that there? There we go.
Could we face gas rationing?
Could we face gas rationing?
So it's getting people worried and panicky about, there's going to be no gas coming out of the supply.
Well, look, let me put this in perspective.
You can see what's coming though, can't you?
You can see what's coming, but let's put it in perspective, okay? And there was other headlines saying 36 hours from running out of gas. Yeah, meanwhile, Sam Laidlaw, the Chief Executive Officer of Centrica, which owns British Gas, has just been awarded a £4 million bonus. Look, these guys operating at this level in the corporations, they have contingency plans on contingency plans on contingency plans. I mean, if they didn't, they shouldn't be doing that job. So the suggestion that we might face gas rationing is purely propaganda to try and get into people's consciousness the fact that we've got to start drilling and tapping into this massive gas resource that sits under England. I mean, let me just remind people that the last time we saw this sort of level of propaganda related directly to the hydrocarbons industry was 1974, when the British government of the day issued petrol ration coupons. And tankers were literally being held offshore and prevented from docking because the British government in '74 wanted to convince the British public that there was the OPEC were the nasty guys, and they were preventing supplies coming in from the UK. And this manipulation was all about getting people to accept a massive increase in the price of oil. I've talked about this in other presentations. I won't go into too much detail of that now. But here we go. We see the same propaganda. And the reality is, it is my opinion that yes, obviously, if we drill into the gas, the government will say yes, thanks very much for the extra revenues from the corporations. The corporations will see massive profits. The bankers will say thank you very much because now you can start to pay us even more interest and you can borrow more money. But the reality is, you can have your cheap gas, or you can have clean water, but you can't have both. And my opinion, and this is actually shared by some of my former colleagues in the oil industry, who actually believe that fracking should never have been started in a land-based environment.
Okay, well, obviously in order to get this legislation through, if they wanted to enable widespread fracking across the land in the UK, they've got to get various legislation passed. You mentioned something that's happening in the House of Lords about this. Could you just explain that? Well,
I mean, obviously, in areas like Blackpool, in Sussex, Balcombe, which is also a quadrilla area, in the Mendips, in Somerset, in South Wales, the licence holder there is a company called UK Methane. It's a Bridgend based company. The chairman of that company is a guy called Gerwyn Llewellyn Williams. Then we have the Wirral and Liverpool, which is iGas Energy. We have the East Midlands, and we have the Central Belt of Scotland. These are the primary targets. Now, the people who live in these areas are perhaps a little bit, or some of the people who live in these areas are a little bit more aware, and so consequently there are frack-free groups popping up. Now, these are not necessarily the traditional environmentalist groups like Greenpeace or Friends of the Earth. I mean, they're also obviously taking a stance, but a lot of the people coming forward and saying, we just don't want this in our area, are not the traditional activists. I mean, there's a guy, Gazer, in Blackpool, who is absolutely convinced that the damage to his property is directly attributable to the seismic event which was related to quadrillas drilling and fracking a couple of years ago. And right now, Gazer is camped out with his van and his placards in a field adjacent to the quadrilla rig. Now, up until this event, I mean, Gazer was not an activist in any way, shape or form. But obviously, since that time, he's been researching this issue, and he's now decided to devote his energies to try and prevent this from becoming standard practice in the UK. So what we're seeing is individuals coming out, and obviously they're getting together. I mean, in Blackpool, there's 3 separate groups trying to fight this. And what the British government needs to do, or wants to do, is to introduce legislation that literally rides roughshod over any local opposition. So even if the local council or the county council says, no, we're not going to permit fracking in our area, the central government is introducing legislation. It's called the Growth and Infrastructure Bill, which will give it the opportunity to override local and regional politicians, all on the basis that this issue is so critical to the UK's energy security and financial security that they're not going to take any opposition.
So this growth and infrastructure bill, presumably there will be a vote at some point.
Well, it's passed the Commons, it's in the Lords.
All right, so it's already been passed.
Yeah,
and it has
in the Commons.
Right, but it could get blocked in the Lords. So
it's unlikely.
People are wasting their time going to their MP then, because it's already gone through. They need to contact the House of Lords, or how?
Well, I think people need to go to their MP and their local councillor, and they need to ask them what their stance is on the fracking issue.
Okay.
And basically they need to get them to educate themselves, because the media is trying to demonize anybody who challenges the drilling and fracking agenda as an eco-zealot or just an environmentalist, a communist, a socialist.
Yeah.
They're basically trying to marginalize them, whilst completely and utterly ignoring the facts. And I mean, let me tell you, on the 1st of February, Richard, I went up to Blackpool to meet with the Quadrilla management team. I wasn't exactly invited, but it was a public event.
Right.
And the purpose of this event was a PR exercise for the Quadrilla management team. It was held in a local caravan park, and they invited the public to come along, look at their display, talk to the leadership team of Quadrilla, and of course the whole idea was to convince the local people they had nothing to worry about. Well, I arrived at about 4:30, and I just sort of tagged on and hung around on the periphery of one of the groups talking to Mark Miller. Now, Mark Miller is the former Chief Executive Officer of Quadrilla, but he was moved aside in the middle of last year, and a guy called Francis Egan was appointed as the CEO. Now, Mark Miller was a particular interest to me because up until 1986, Mark Miller actually worked with my former company, Dower Schlumberger. Okay. Now, I didn't know Mark when he was with the company, and I didn't actually move to the US with Schlumberger until the mid-90s. But I was interested in what Mark had to say, and I stood on the periphery listening to him, but I couldn't keep my silence any longer. After, in response to a question, he said there has never been a proven case of frac fluid contaminating groundwater. Right. And unfortunately, I had an involuntary reaction to that statement. And I said, well, that's not right. Yeah. And he said, oh yeah, it is, absolutely. He said, there's never been a case where frac fluid has contaminated groundwater. Right. Anyway, I challenged that. And at that point, I declared my interest. And I said, Mark, what I'm hearing you say here is basically exactly the same platitudes as we were trotting out in Colorado in the mid-90s when I was with Schlumberger. And at that point, the colour sort of drained from his face. But it wouldn't take any of your viewers more than about 30 seconds to go onto a search engine and punch in frac fluid contamination or frac fluid water contamination, and they'd find numerous examples in the US and in Canada and in Australia of frac fluids having contaminated water.
Okay then, Ian, well, we're going to go for another break, and we'll be talking more about this and other issues after this.